Imagine lying in bed tonight, but instead of drifting off for one continuous stretch of slumber, you sleep for a few hours, wake up in the middle of the night, light a candle, perhaps say a prayer, read a little, or talk with someone beside you, and then you fall asleep again, only to wake naturally with the dawn. This isn't a fantasy or some strange modern idea about healthy rest. This was, for many centuries, the default way to sleep in large parts of Europe, a pattern known as segmented sleep. And if you were alive in the Middle Ages, this habit wouldn't be weird at all. It would be normal. The first reference we have to this strange custom comes from literature, but not fiction. It appears in diaries, medical books, legal records, and even sermons. What they describe is something like this: a first sleep that began not long after dusk, followed by a period of quiet wakefulness around midnight, and then a second sleep that lasted until morning. One 15th century English medical manual even advised, "Sleep after meat for a while, then wake and occupy thyself in study or devotion, then return to thy bed again, and sleep until morning." This wasn't a disruption. It was part of the rhythm of life. But why would people sleep this way? To understand that, we have to set aside our modern clocks, our electric lights, and our caffeine habits. We must return to a world where night was long, much longer in winter, and where sleep was ruled by the sun, by candlelight, and by the cold. In medieval Europe, darkness was more than a visual experience. It was a lifestyle. Nightfall could begin as early as 4 p.m. in winter and not lift until 8 a.m. That's 16 hours of darkness. If you were a peasant with no artificial light or a noble who didn't want to waste expensive candles, you might go to bed early, very early, but humans aren't naturally wired to sleep for 12 or more hours. Instead, we seem to do best with about 7 to 8 hours in total, and so people divided their sleep. They allowed their bodies to rest, wake naturally in the middle of the night, and then return to bed once more. In that liminal zone, between the two sleeps, they did some of their most private, most reflective thinking. Some even claimed it was the best time for prayer or for insight. In fact, this watching time between first and second sleep was often seen as sacred. The Benedictine monks, whose lives were built around schedules of prayer, would rise during this midnight interval for vigils, a quiet, contemplative liturgy meant to praise God in the silence of the night. And the practice wasn't limited to monks. Common people too might rise for a bit, speak with a neighbor, check on a child, or simply sit by the fire. Medical texts from the time even suggest that the period between the two sleeps was ideal for intimacy. Without getting graphic, let's just say that marital beds were not silent in those hours, and it was seen as a healthy time for conception, when the body was rested, the room quiet, and the world asleep. But it wasn't always restful. People also used this time to stoke the fire, refill the lamp, or defend against rats, thieves, or worse. In some places, the night was a time of dread. Folklore whispered of demons and spirits who wandered freely in the gap between sleeps. This hour, sometimes called the watch, was a vulnerable time, when you might see shadows move or feel a presence in the room that wasn't there before. Imagine waking up in total darkness, no street lamps, no glowing screens, just the distant sound of wind or rain and the creaking of the roof beams overhead. Maybe you light a rushlight and peer at the shape of your sleeping children. Or maybe you sit quietly and let your thoughts wander. Some even wrote during this time. Letters, religious tracts, and poems were often composed during these hushed hours. The 17th century writer Robert Burton called this period the best time to study, since it was free from noise, from distractions, and from interruption. And while we moderns might see this as insomnia, or worse, sleep dysfunction, people back then didn't think of it that way. The concept of sleeping through the night without waking is a relatively recent invention, one that seems to have risen only with the Industrial Revolution and the rise of artificial light. Electricity shrank the night. It made staying up easier, but also collapsed the boundaries between waking and sleeping. By the late 19th century, the idea of segmented sleep had all but disappeared from medical literature and social custom. Doctors began to see waking in the middle of the night as a problem, something to be fixed. But for hundreds of years, it wasn't a problem. It was life. Of course, not every medieval person followed this pattern exactly. Sleep habits varied by region, by class, by climate. A noble in France might go to bed in an upstairs room lined with tapestries and thick bedding, while a shepherd in Scotland might doze under the stars in summer and huddle near livestock for warmth in winter. But the general structure held true. A division of the night into two parts, bridged by a brief and often meaningful wakefulness. It's strange to imagine now. Most of us aim for 7 or 8 uninterrupted hours and consider waking at 3 a.m. a sign of stress or illness. But maybe, just maybe, it's a distant echo of a forgotten rhythm, a memory held somewhere deep in our bones from a time when the night was longer, the world quieter, and sleep came in 2 acts. And perhaps that's the real question. If your body woke you up at midnight, not in fear or stress, but in calm clarity, what would you do with that time? So now you're awake. It's somewhere between midnight and 2 a.m. The fire has burned low, but there's still a faint warmth near the hearth. Outside, the wind moves through the village like a sleeping breath, slow and shallow. The chickens are silent. The streets are empty. This is the quietest moment of the night. And in the Middle Ages, this wasn't strange at all. This was the hour between sleeps. It was called the watch, or simply the waking. And while the modern world might interpret waking up at this hour as a sign of restlessness, in medieval life, it was part of a well-regarded cycle. The question wasn't why you were awake. The question was, what would you do now? For many, it was prayer. Deep, reflective, silent prayer. One might recite psalms by memory or whisper personal petitions in the still air, even those without formal. Religious training had memorized parts of the liturgy or well-known prayers, repeated almost like mantras. Priests and monks encouraged this, preaching that the silence of night made one's words more pure, more potent. Others might use the time to think, not daydreaming, but structured inward thought, about debts, about sins, about family, about fields. What we might call anxiety today, they often framed as reckoning, a reckoning with God, with neighbors, with fate, quiet contemplation. In the middle of the night was encouraged, especially if it led to confession or to changes in behavior. In wealthier homes, this period could be used for reading. Candles and oil lamps were expensive, too expensive for peasants, but nobles, monks, and scholars might keep a light burning. It's here that we see some of the few documented cases of solitary reading at night. Books were precious, hand-copied, and rare. But for those who had them, night reading was seen as both virtuous and practical. Then there was work. Yes, work. The night watch provided a window for tasks that didn't require full light or noise. Bakers, for instance, were often up before first light, kneading dough and preparing ovens. Midwives and healers might be called during this hour. Some women spun wool by low firelight. Scribes sometimes copied manuscripts in these hours, when the world was least likely to interrupt. For families living communally with 1 or 2 rooms at most, privacy was rare. The period between sleeps was one of the few times when conversations could happen in whispers about feelings, plans, hopes, regrets, without the children hearing or the neighbors listening through the thin walls of wattle and daub. And then there was sex. This wasn't spoken of loudly in records, but it shows up in odd places. Medical books, folk advice, even church warnings. Doctors of the time believed that intercourse between the 2 sleeps was better for conception. The body had rested, they said, and was now warm, relaxed, and more fertile. It was less about pleasure and more about timing. In fact, some fertility guides from the period recommend this exact moment, halfway through the night, when the soul is quiet and the air is still. There's a kind of honesty here, a quiet honesty, where the night, far from being dead time, was intimate and thoughtful and real, and yet not everyone welcomed the night watch. For some it brought fear. There were no flashlights, no electricity. A candle might flicker out. A spark might catch a rush mat on fire. Sounds carried in strange ways through the night. Footsteps, animal cries, creaking beams. And then, of course, there were the other fears. Folklore was rich with nighttime dangers. Witches, demons, wandering spirits. In many households, the sign of the cross was made before bed, again upon waking and once more before returning to sleep. Some placed iron nails, blessed herbs, or crosses near their beds to ward off spirits. Cats were seen as protectors, not just of food, but of the soul. They watched the darkness. One popular belief warned against leaving your shoes pointing toward the door. Evil spirits, it was said, would see this as an invitation to step into them and take your place. Others avoided looking into mirrors at night. A glance at the wrong time might show a face behind your own. Still, most of this fear was managed with ritual and familiarity. Just as we today have our night routines, our glasses of water, our phone checks, our locking of doors, medieval people had theirs. Some would bank the fire carefully, arranging coals and ash just so to keep the embers alive till morning. Others would check livestock one last time, or say a blessing over their children as they slept. In cities, night watchmen patrolled with lanterns and staves, calling out the hours and announcing the weather. 3 o'clock and all is well. That call itself was comforting. It let people know the time, that the world was still turning, that the town had not burned down, that they could perhaps rest again. But not everyone returned to sleep easily. There are stories scattered in letters and sermons of people who grew too accustomed to their wakefulness, who used the midnight hours to gamble, to drink, to slip away from the house for reasons best not spoken. Some towns had laws forbidding people to loiter after curfew, but human nature does not always rest when it should. One account from 14th century Bruges tells of a baker's apprentice who, during the night watch, began sneaking into the homes of neighbors to steal their rising dough. He was eventually caught, not by guards, but by an old woman who woke between sleeps, heard him, and chased him down with a broom. And then there were the lonely. In a world without podcasts, without bedside lamps or melatonin gummies, the silence could be overwhelming, especially for widows, for the elderly, for the sick. Some simply lay awake, watching the ceiling beams, waiting for the body to grow heavy again. And this, too, was part of the pattern. Not every night was equal. Some nights, the second sleep came quickly, others not at all. Some woke from nightmares, others from cold feet. Some slept through and felt no different at all. So what changed? Why did we abandon this ancient rhythm? One answer lies in the brightness. With the rise of gas lamps in the 19th century, followed quickly by electricity, the night grew shorter, visibly, socially and psychologically. Artificial light made it possible to stay up later, and as the evening hours lengthened, the pressure grew to consolidate sleep, to fit it neatly into a single block, efficient and productive. Midnight was no longer a sacred pause. It became a problem. And so, by the early 20th century, first and second sleeps were no longer part of daily life. They became something strange, something odd enough that when sleep researchers rediscovered references to it in the 1990s, it caused a minor sensation. But for those who lived through it, it wasn't strange at all. It was life. So now, here's the question. If this ancient rhythm is still inside us, what would it mean to return to it? You wake with the sun, not with an alarm, not with the buzzing of a phone, but with the first glow of light pressing through wooden shutters or slipping past a thatched roof's gaps. The room is grey-blue. The fire is just ash. You've had your second sleep, and it's time to begin the day. That's how the rhythm ended. No fanfare, no final prayer, just a gradual return from the mystery of the night. In the medieval world, this was the natural conclusion to a pattern most people never thought twice about. First sleep, wakefulness, second sleep, morning, like breathing, like the cycle of seasons, unremarkable and yet deeply human. But nothing in history stays untouched forever. As the medieval era gave way to the early modern period, somewhere between the 16th and 18th centuries, this ancient cycle began to unravel. Slowly at first, then suddenly, and it happened not because people changed, but because their world did. The first culprit: light. By the late 1600s, cities like Paris and London were installing street lamps. At first, these were fueled by oil or tallow, tended manually each evening. But their effect was dramatic. Darkness, once total and unquestioned, became partial, tamed. In elite households, candles were replaced with brighter and more plentiful oil lamps, and with more light came more night activity, later suppers, evening music, longer conversations, and reading past dusk. Sleep shifted. It shrank. Then came coffee. By the mid-1600s, coffee houses began to appear in England and France, bringing with them not just a stimulant, but a new kind of culture, one built around alertness, discussion, business, and wit. Where ale had once lulled the body into slumber, coffee sharpened the mind. It allowed merchants, lawyers, and poets to stretch their evenings deeper into the night, to choose wakefulness rather than slip into it between sleeps. And still the world spun faster. With the rise of factories and industrial timekeeping in the 18th and 19th centuries, work shifted from sun-based cycles to mechanical ones. The clock became the tyrant. A single uninterrupted sleep, beginning late and ending early, became a social requirement. Waking in the night was no longer a spiritual window or natural pause. It was inefficient. Medical texts began to label middle-of-the-night wakefulness as a symptom of illness. Sleep, once understood as a flowing thing, was now treated as a fixed commodity. You were either getting enough of it, or you weren't. There was no room for nuance. The idea of two sleeps, so familiar to our ancestors, faded from memory, but not entirely. In the 1990s, historian Roger Ekirch published a groundbreaking study based on years of research into diaries, legal testimony, court records, and personal letters from the Middle Ages and early modern period. He discovered hundreds of references to first sleep and second sleep, so casual, so constant, that it proved what had long been forgotten. Segmented sleep was real. It was normal. And we'd lost it. The public was fascinated. Articles were written, documentaries aired. Sleep researchers began to explore what it might mean for our understanding of insomnia, rest, and nighttime anxiety. It turns out, waking in the middle of the night might be one of the most natural things you can do. In one study, volunteers were placed in environments without artificial light for several weeks. Their sleep began to segment, naturally and without prompting. They went to bed earlier, woke in the middle of the night, then slept again until morning. Just like our medieval ancestors, the implications were profound. It suggested that our modern expectation of 8 uninterrupted hours might not be biological at all, but rather cultural, historical. A product of factories, clocks, light bulbs, and deadlines, and we've lost something small but precious, the stillness of that hour between sleeps, the quiet thinking, the hushed prayer, the presence, a time when the world was neither asleep nor awake, and you could exist outside of noise, outside of productivity, outside of performance. You didn't have to be on, you didn't have to be resting, you could just be. In a strange twist, some people today are trying to return to this pattern. Sleep coaches, alternative health blogs, and mindfulness practitioners speak of biphasic sleep, encouraging people to embrace the wakeful moments instead of fearing them. Some even schedule it, sleeping for 4 hours, then rising to journal, meditate, or sit quietly in the dark before returning to bed. But it's not easy to reclaim a lost rhythm in a world built against it. Our cities never sleep. Our phones glow endlessly. Our lives are structured in single blocks of time, optimized and measured. And yet, some nights you still wake. Maybe it's 2:18 a.m. You sit up, you breathe, you wonder, what if you didn't grab your phone? What if you just waited, sat in the dark, listened to the silence, tended to the thoughts that only arrive when the world is sleeping? What if, like your ancestors, you didn't see it as a failure? What if it was a gift, a window into a different kind of rest, not measured in minutes, but in meaning, not interrupted, but whole in its own way, not broken, just forgotten? And maybe the next time you wake up in the middle of the night, you'll remember this story, the one about the 2 sleeps, and you'll smile quietly, knowing you're not alone in the dark. You never were. Close your eyes for a moment. Now imagine you're lying in a bed, if you can call it that, made of a sagging wooden frame, roped lattice, and a mattress filled with straw that's been used, refluffed, and reused again. It smells faintly of mildew, body odor, and ash. Beneath your thin woolen blanket, your toes are icy. A breeze creeps in through cracks in the wall, and the stones that make up the room's walls are slick with cold. Outside, it's snowing, but you wouldn't know because in this room, it's just always cold. This was the nightly experience of many medieval people. In lower households, things were worse. Peasants' homes were often just one-room structures, with earthen floors and no chimney. The smoke from the fire drifted through the rafters, and exited through a hole in the roof, if at all. Soot clung to the beams. Clothes reeked of smoke. And yet that fire was your only protection from the bitter cold, and so people got creative with warmth. They slept in groups. Families, servants, and even guests often shared beds, not for intimacy, but for survival. A child between parents wasn't just a comfort, it was a source of heat. In some cases, animals were brought inside during winter nights. Chickens, goats, even pigs might share the living space, their bodies radiating warmth. It wasn't ideal, but it was warmer. And then there was the bed itself. If you were poor, you slept on a pile of straw, sometimes with a coarse sheet of linen if you were lucky. The straw would be stuffed into a coarse sack and laid directly on the floor, or on a simple wooden pallet. Over time, the straw would flatten and grow musty, infested with bugs. It had to be fluffed or replaced often, but most people couldn't afford that luxury. If you were wealthier, your bed might have a rope lattice under the mattress. These ropes would sag and stretch with use, which is where the phrase "sleep tight" comes from. Tightening the ropes was a nightly chore. Above that might be a feather mattress, luxurious by comparison, but still lumpy and prone to mold in damp climates. Pillows were few and often filled with down or wool. Sheets, if present, were hand-woven, rarely washed, and never changed with any frequency we'd find acceptable today. And blankets, mostly wool, thick, scratchy, and heavy. Sometimes fur-lined or layered with animal hides, but warmth wasn't guaranteed, not by a long shot. People went to bed wearing most of what they wore during the day. Linen undershirts, woolen tunics, nightcaps, even gloves. Socks or foot wraps were common, as were heated stones placed near the feet, wrapped in cloth and pulled from the fire's edge just before sleep. These stones didn't stay warm long, but for the first few minutes under the covers, they were bliss. And still, it was cold. Letters from the period mention fingers that couldn't hold pens in the morning, ink frozen in its pots, chamber pots solid with ice. In monasteries, monks sometimes warmed their hands by placing them under their robes against the skin. In castles, nobles might keep dogs in their chambers not just for protection, but for body heat. There was no such thing as central heating. There were no space heaters, no electric blankets, no warm baths before bed. To be cold was to be alive in winter. But cold brought more than just discomfort. It shaped behavior. People went to bed early, not because they were tired, but because it was the only way to conserve warmth. They pulled the covers high, curled into balls, and rarely moved. Waking in the night, as we explored in the last story, was common, but in the coldest seasons it became a risk. Getting out of bed meant braving the chill. So unless there was a fire to tend or an emergency, people stayed under the covers, often lying still for hours. The bed became a kind of cocoon, a fragile island of heat in a frozen world. And then there were the night sounds, the groaning of wooden beams contracting in the cold, the scuttling of rats or insects in the thatch, the howling wind, the distant creak of shutters swinging loose. These were normal, not frightening, just the song of a medieval winter. Of course, there were exceptions. The wealthiest castles, especially in France and Italy, sometimes had braziers or metal fire pits. These glowed hot but also risked carbon monoxide poisoning. In fact, deaths from bad air were not uncommon, though no one understood the science behind it at the time. They simply called it the foulness of still rooms. Some lords had access to bed warmers, metal pans filled with coals run between the sheets before bedtime to take the edge off the chill. These tools were expensive, dangerous, and rarely used in lower classes. A careless moment could set linen, aflame. But if you had access to such luxuries, it was seen as a mark of power. Guests might speak of a good night's warmth in a particular hall, and the reputation of hospitality spread partly by how warm the guest chamber was. And yet, even with wealth, comfort was fragile. Even kings got cold. In one account, Edward I of England reportedly suffered terribly during winter campaigns, his bedding damp, his fire poor, his sleep brief and broken. Queen Isabella of France is said to have requested 3 feather mattresses during her stay in Yorkshire, only to complain of the endless chill. There was no escaping it. So why does this matter? Why focus on such mundane, chilly details? Because sleep tells us what mattered. It shows us how people coped, how they endured, how they carved out small comforts in a harsh world. And because, in those cold, quiet nights, wrapped in wool, whispering prayers, or sharing warmth with loved ones, medieval people were not so different from us. We forget how new our comforts are. How strange our expectations of warmth and softness would seem to them, and it leads us to wonder, what if all our luxury has dulled us to the beauty of survival itself? Let's stay in that room a bit longer. The fire has faded now. All that remains are dull orange coals and the faint scent of smoke and wool. Someone shifts under the blankets beside you, a slow rustle of fabric, a muffled cough, then stillness again. The air bites at your nose. Your feet are numb. This was normal, because medieval sleeping wasn't a solitary affair, not for most people. The cold didn't just shape the architecture or the bedding, it shaped how people arranged their lives. Who slept with whom, what they wore, what they shared, and quietly, what they endured. Let's start with the practice of bed sharing. Modern sensibilities might consider it intimate, even awkward, but in medieval Europe, sharing a bed was routine. Entire families often slept in the same bed, not out of emotional closeness, but economic necessity and environmental logic. A peasant household might consist of a single room, parents, children, a grandparent or two, maybe a servant. Beds were scarce. Space was scarcer. If there was a loft, children might sleep on straw mats above, close to the thatched roof, warmer in summer, draftier in winter. But more often than not, everyone piled into one bed. Sometimes this included guests. In fact, in inns and taverns across Europe, sleeping with strangers was common. You might rent half a bed for the night, sharing it with a merchant, a pilgrim, a soldier, or a wandering bard. If you were lucky, they didn't snore. If you weren't, well, you endured. This wasn't a violation of personal space. There was no personal space. Privacy, as a modern concept, simply didn't exist in the same way. You dressed in front of others, you ate communally, and you slept where warmth was. Even royalty wasn't exempt from these shared sleeping arrangements. Noble children slept beside their nurses or tutors. Pages slept at the foot of their lords. Bed, ready to serve. Royalty, though more insulated, still kept company in their chambers. Servants, bodyguards, and courtiers often slept close by, not just for protection, but because the warmth of multiple bodies helped everyone survive. Of course, the closer you slept, the more you shared. Not just warmth, but insects. Bugs were a fact of life. Lice, fleas, bed bugs. These weren't signs of poor hygiene. Everyone had them. Even the cleanest noblewoman, bathed in rosewater, powdered in crushed herbs, dressed in silk, likely shared her sheets with unwelcome guests. Straw. Mattresses were notorious breeding grounds. Fleas nested in the seams. Lice hid in wool blankets. Even the furniture could host colonies of bedbugs, hiding in joints and carvings, emerging only when the room grew still and the air grew warm with breath. To cope, people developed routines. Beds were aired out on sunny days. Blankets were beaten and combed. Herbal mixtures, lavender, wormwood, mint, and camphor, were sewn into sachets and stuffed between sheets, not because they killed bugs, but because they masked the smell and made the sleeper feel protected. In some regions, women would wash children's hair with vinegar or ash soap before bed, hoping to reduce infestations. Others shaved the heads, of children entirely, believing lice fed on hair. It wasn't always effective, but it was effort, and effort meant survival. Let's shift now to what people wore to bed. The idea of a dedicated nightgown existed in some wealthy households, but most people simply slept in their underclothes. A linen shift or long undershirt. These were comfortable, reusable, and easy to wash, though washing still meant hauling water, heating it, and scrubbing with harsh soap. Nightcaps were common, not for fashion, but warmth. Heat escapes from the head, and in cold stone rooms, a wool or linen cap was as essential as a blanket. Men might wear long tunics or double their day garments. Women sometimes slept in full chemises with drawstring necks to preserve heat. Socks were layered. Fingers might be tucked into sleeves or mittens. Still, some people slept nude, not for pleasure, but for practicality. Wet clothes took forever to dry. In some cases, removing them helped preserve the dry layers for the next day. There are accounts of workers drying their outer garments near the fire while lying under a blanket, bare, hoping to keep at least something dry by morning. Then there were rituals, small acts done before bed to prepare for sleep in the cold. Some placed warmed stones under the covers. Others sipped ale or mead before lying down, not to get drunk, but to dull the edge of the cold. A few whispered prayers for warmth, asking saints to guard their dreams. Children were tucked in with layers of cloth and animal hides. Stories were told, not just for comfort, but as distraction from the discomfort. Old tales of warmth, of summer fields, of saints who protected wanderers in snow. In monasteries, the cold was part of discipline. Monks in northern Europe often slept fully clothed, sometimes even in their habits. Their beds were Spartan, wooden slats or narrow pallets, a single blanket if permitted. Night was a time of humility, of suffering, of quiet reflection. Sleep was not for luxury, it was for restoration and spiritual readiness. In contrast, nobles indulged in layers, furs, tapestries, feather beds. In France, records show purchases of ermine-lined bedspreads and double mattresses of goose down. A rich lord's bed might be so piled with coverings that getting into it was a task in itself. But even these measures could not eliminate the chill entirely, because the cold crept in. Always, and no one, not kings, not peasants, not nuns, was fully spared from it. So they adapted, with shared beds, with layered clothes, with dogs and prayers and hot stones, with silence and stillness, with an understanding that the night was to be endured, not controlled. And yet, in the stillness of that endurance, there was connection. The kind that only comes when you're forced to lie close to others, to breathe together, to feel another's heartbeat in the same blanket of cold. Today, we take warmth for granted. A dial on the wall, a heated blanket, a soft mattress. Our sleep is solitary, temperature controlled, often silent. But maybe, just maybe, We've lost something in the process. What does it mean that we no longer have to huddle, to share, to endure the dark together? The cold didn't just shape how medieval people slept, it shaped who they were. It shaped their families, their habits, even their superstitions. Night after night, month after month, year after year. When your nights are spent curled tightly in damp straw or pressed shoulder to shoulder in a smoky room, you begin to live differently. You begin to dream differently. By the time we reach the end of the Middle Ages in the 15th century, small shifts had already begun. Wealth was concentrating. Furniture became more refined. Wealthy merchants, minor nobles, and even prosperous peasants began investing in better beds, not necessarily warmer, but taller, softer, and more decorated. And so, the bedstead emerged. These were not just beds, they were symbols, carved wood frames, thick curtains for privacy and warmth, raised canopies, feather mattresses piled high, linen sheets woven finer. The bedstead became a centerpiece of the home, a literal elevation of sleep from the floor to the realm of display. Guests were sometimes shown the bed, even if they never touched it. Just as today we might show off a home theater or a walk-in closet, medieval families showed off beds. But while the wealthy ascended into feathered dreams, most people remained grounded. Straw pallets, shared spaces, cold nights. So how did we get from that to where we are now? The transition was gradual. Heating technology was one major turning point. Chimneys, once rare and reserved for the very rich, became more common by the 16th century. Instead of an open hearth in the center of a room, fireplaces could now be built into walls, with smoke drawn away more efficiently. This improved warmth, reduced soot, and made rooms more habitable. Still, for centuries afterward, heating remained a luxury. Even into the 19th century, most homes were heated by wood or coal fires in individual rooms, if at all. Bedrooms were still freezing in winter, and bed-warming rituals, hot stones, brass pans, bottles of warm water, remained standard. Then came industrialization. As cities grew, building methods changed. Insulation improved. Mass-produced fabrics became more available. Cotton sheets, woolen blankets, and feather pillows could be purchased rather than handmade. The humble mattress evolved, stuffed with cotton, horsehair, or springs, and with factories came central heating. At first in public buildings, later in homes, steam radiators, hot air ducts. By the early 20th century, temperature control was no longer a fantasy. It was an expectation. The cold bed, once a universal human condition, became a choice, and that choice created a strange forgetting. We forgot what it meant to suffer the cold in silence, to sleep surrounded by others, not for comfort but for warmth, to lie still under scratchy wool and listen for rats, to wake with frozen fingers and smoke-choked lungs. We replaced those memories with softness, with pillow tops and thermal sheets, with sleep hygiene checklists and ergonomic pillows, with heated floors and climate-controlled sleep pods. You can now download apps to control your blanket's temperature from your phone. And if you wake cold, you don't pull a dog closer, you tap a button, and maybe that's progress. Maybe it's comfort, safety, rest. But it also means that our sleep no longer tells the story of our survival. It doesn't bind us together as it once did. We no longer crawl into bed as a family, whispering stories to drown out the wind. We no longer sleep face to face with strangers at an inn, hoping the fire stays lit. We no longer press fingers against another's back, not for love, but for warmth. Instead, we sleep alone, in silence, And even that silence has changed. Where once there was the crackle of fire and the rustle of straw, now there is the hum of electricity, the soft glow of phones, the quiet buzz of a heating vent. We have engineered the wildness out of night. We have replaced community with comfort. And yet, when you lie very still, on a night when the power goes out, and the room grows colder than usual, something returns. A whisper, a memory in your bones, of nights spent curled in straw, of cold breath forming tiny clouds in the dark, of bodies close together under woolen blankets, telling stories in the dark, surviving the endless cold together. A warmth not from fire, but from presence. A warmth born not of temperature, but of trust. And so we end this story not with a solution, but with a question: what have we gained in warmth? And what have we lost in no longer needing each other to survive the dark? Picture this: a long wooden hall, smoky with torchlight, half lit by dying embers in a central hearth. The smell of meat fat, spilled ale and damp wool lingers in the air. A few rats dart across the edges of the rush-covered floor. The feast is over. The fire is low. The Lord is asleep upstairs. But the servants are still here, settling down quietly in the same space where earlier that night nobles laughed and dogs barked and jugs of wine were tipped too far. This is where they sleep, not in rooms of their own, not even in beds, but on the floor, among the rushes, with a folded cloak or bundled apron as a pillow, and the same clothes worn all day still on their backs. And in this half-warm, half-sour darkness, they find rest, because there is no other. Choice. This was medieval life for the people who served. Servants, stewards, stable boys, scullery maids, pages, wet nurses, cooks. They made the castles run, but they were almost never seen asleep, because their sleeping didn't look like rest to anyone who didn't live it. It looked like someone collapsed where they stood. It looked like someone curled in a hallway, or next to a barrel, or on a bench still warm from the backsides of nobles. Medieval sleep was deeply stratified, because society was. Where you rested depended entirely on who you were. If you were noble or royal, you had a bedchamber, maybe even more than one. These rooms were rarely private in the modern sense, but they were removed, upstairs away from noise, often behind heavy doors or tapestries. A noble's bed was both a symbol of status and a site of power, sometimes literally. Important meetings, secret plots, and confessions might take place in the privacy of a chamber, but most people in the household never saw that side of night. They lived in the hall, a single multi-purpose room that was equal parts dining room, workroom, courtroom, and dormitory. After supper, the furniture might be pushed aside, the hearth raked, the rushes swept, and then quietly those who served would find a place to sleep. Rushes, bundles of dried reeds or straw, were not soft, but they were better than bare wood. Spread across the floor, sometimes mixed with herbs like thyme or lavender, they soaked up spills, disguised smells, and made the floor slightly less painful. Still, they were never clean, not really. They were changed only a few times a year, if that. Often they were swept aside and reused. Insects lived in them, mice burrowed under them, bits of food, bone, and dirt collected in them, and it was in these rushes that many people laid down their heads. Sleep came in layers. The cook might settle near the embers to stay warm. The stable hand might sleep near the door to hear any knock or alarm. The maid might lie under a table out of the way. People often slept in shifts. The youngest, the least senior, the lowest in status, they got the coldest corners. There were no mattresses, no privacy, No separation between work and rest. If you were lucky, you had a woolen cloak to wrap around you. If you were very lucky, you had someone to curl up with. Not out of affection necessarily, but for heat. Even those in higher service, like stewards or ladies-in-waiting, seldom had their own rooms. At best they had a pallet bed behind a curtain, a screen, an alcove, something that said, "You are not the Lord, but you are not entirely expendable either." And then, of course, came the bells, because in the wealthier households and noble estates, servants were expected to be on call at all hours. A bell rope might hang from the Lord's chamber, connected by cords to the sleeping quarters. Below, a single tug meant, "Rise, bring water, fetch a lantern, summon the steward, attend the master." And so, servants learned to sleep lightly, half alert, ears open, one foot still in the waking world. To sleep deeply was a luxury not afforded to those in service. To be startled awake and respond swiftly could mean the difference between keeping your place and losing it, especially for women, whose reputations and positions could be ruined by the whisper of slowness or inattention. Even in monasteries, where order and silence reigned, servants and lay brothers followed a grueling rhythm. They rose before dawn, prepared food and fires for the monks, and worked long hours without complaint. When they slept, it was briefly, sometimes in cells, sometimes in sheds, sometimes under the stars. And then there were the nobles. Wealth brought comfort, yes, but not always rest. Many nobles slept with guards nearby, not for warmth, but protection. Political unrest, family betrayal, and local feuds made a noble's bed a place of anxiety. Swords hung nearby, doors were barred. Dogs slept at the foot of the bed, not pets but guardians. And still they often woke at night, not just for prayers or chamber pots, but from nightmares, from cold, from worry. Nobles slept in stages too, not because they had to, but because they were human, just like everyone else. And in those quiet, candle-lit hours, the line between servant and lord could blur, if only for a moment. Everyone breathed the same cold air. Everyone listened to the creak of timbers and the distant rustle of animals. Everyone waited for morning. But still, there was a difference, because in the morning, the Lord rose slowly, perhaps to hot water, clean clothes, and soft light. The servant? The servant was already awake, already at work, already sweeping the rushes where they had just slept. And so we end this section with a question: what does it mean to rest, if your rest is never seen, never private, and never fully your own? Let's imagine you are a servant again. You've swept the floor, gathered bones from the feast, refilled jugs, banked the hearth, and folded the rushes back where they belong. The torches are dying. A few embers glow in the stone hearth. A dog lies snoring beneath the trestle table. This is your time, your only time, and yet you don't feel free. You lie in the hall, one arm still in your apron, one foot still in the world of duty. You don't undress, you don't sprawl. You sleep curled, tense, alert. This is half sleep. It wasn't just a condition, it was a way of life for those who served in the Middle Ages. To sleep half aware wasn't a flaw, it was survival. Because rest, true, uninterrupted, deep rest, wasn't safe for everyone. The world of service was built on vigilance. For cooks, Sleep ended early, long before sunrise. Dough needed kneading, fires needed tending, ovens needed heating. These weren't optional duties, they were sacred routines. If breakfast was late, the master noticed. If the hearth was cold, there were consequences. Sleep was squeezed between tasks. For chambermaids, sleep came only after the lady was settled and ended the moment she stirred. In wealthy houses, women of status often slept lightly and demanded comfort. A repositioned curtain, a drink of water, a whispered prayer, a combed tangle of hair. The chambermaid might be roused 5, 6, 7 times in one night. To complain was unthinkable. Servants were taught to disappear into usefulness, to be present but invisible. And so sleep was never full, never free. It was something you fit in the cracks, something you folded into your service. Some historians refer to this as task-fragmented rest. It was not sleep in the modern sense, but scattered moments of rest layered between obligations. You might sleep after a delivery, between chores while watching a pot simmer, or curled near the stables on a rainy afternoon. These fragments added up, but never to wholeness. And yet they coped. Some learned to nap standing up, against door frames, barn walls, even barrels. Others learned to close their eyes in prayer, posture, fooling superiors into thinking they were meditating. Some simply accepted exhaustion as the price of position. If you were lucky, the body adapted. If you weren't, it wore you down. In larger manors, some servants slept in garrets, small, rooms under the eaves accessible by steep, narrow stairs. These spaces were barely more than crawl spaces. Sloped ceilings, rough wood, no heat, rats in the rafters. But they offered a kind of privacy, a place to lay a blanket without the lord's boots nearby. In towns, apprentices slept near their tools. Blacksmiths curled under workbenches. Bakers dozed near ovens. Tanners slept on crates, their clothes stiff with hide oils. Their sleep smelled of their trade. The shoemaker's bed stank of leather, the cook's of grease, the brewer of yeast and spilled hops. Some servants shared beds in pairs or groups, even if they had small rooms, not for closeness, but to conserve heat, to share dreams or silence. There are mentions of whispered conversations between servants, sharing news, rumors, jokes, fears, all in that thin sliver of night when the world was quiet. These conversations were precious, because servants were not only physically exhausted, they were socially silenced. Their voices mattered only during the day and only when called. But at night in the dark, lying side by side in the rushes or curled on rough blankets, they could speak without formality. The night was the only place their humanity could stretch, if only a little. Meanwhile, the lords above, yes, they had beds. But light sleep was a constant for them too. Fear haunted the upper chambers. In an age of betrayal, poisonings, and power struggles, sleep was never fully trusted. Lords locked their doors, posted guards, and still slept with knives nearby. Some historians describe nobles as light sleepers by design. If you slept too deeply, you might wake to find your title gone, or your life. In castles under siege or in feuding families, nighttime was a danger zone. Assassins didn't knock at noon. They came in silence, in slippers, with daggers dipped in silence, and so nobles trained themselves to wake at the slightest sound, a creaking board, a whisper. So a dog's whimper. Some even feigned sleep while awake, testing servants or listening for disloyalty. Sleep was never just sleep, it was strategy. Even among clergy, light sleep was encouraged. Vigilant sleep. Monks were expected to wake for prayers at fixed hours, matins, lauds. Interruptions were holy. The body, they believed, should never fall too deeply into sin or sloth. Even in sleep, a monk must be ready to rise. So from top to bottom, across the pyramid of medieval life, sleep was something borrowed, never fully owned. It was shaped by status, by place, by role, by the watchful eyes of others. And even today, fragments of that world remain. Think of night shift workers, on-call nurses, mothers sleeping with one ear open, people falling asleep in uniforms, shoes still on. The habit of sleeping just in case you're needed. The nervous awareness of being needed soon. We think sleep today is personal, private. But history tells another story, and it asks a quiet question. What if our sleep still carries the memory of all the times it wasn't truly ours? Morning comes, but it doesn't come with sunlight. It comes with footsteps, with a shouted name, with the clang of a pot dropped in the kitchen hearth. The light is still grey-blue, but the hall is already moving. Servants rise without complaint, folding their cloaks, brushing dried rushes from their sleeves. The noble still sleeps upstairs. You, however, are already halfway through your morning. This is how the day began for thousands across medieval Europe. And it's how the night ended, not gently but abruptly. Not with a stretch and a yawn, but with the return of duty. There were no alarm clocks. The bell tower told time, yes, but most servants didn't need it. Their clocks were human, waking. To the shuffle of the steward's boots, to the creak of the kitchen door, to the sigh of a child stirring in the bed beside them, you knew when to rise, because to rise late was to be noticed, and that was dangerous. In noble households, lateness was a breach of discipline. In monastic ones, it was a spiritual failing. In city homes, it was a risk to livelihood. If you were replaced, there were dozens waiting. Servants, apprentices, wet nurses, they all lived on the edge of sleep and labor. So when we speak of medieval rest, we must remember, sleep was a privilege measured in class, space, and time. You slept well only if someone else worked through the night to make it possible. The Lord's down mattress, cleaned and fluffed by hand, the fire in the chamber, tended by someone who'd slept beside coals in the kitchen, the scented sheets, carried up steep stairs by tired hands, folded with precision, sprinkled with dried rosemary. The silence, maintained by everyone else whispering in hallways, walking barefoot across stone, stifling their coughs. And because servants had no bedrooms, no doors to close, they also had no secrets. You slept where you could be seen. In the hall, on the floor, beside a stable, because to talk of dreams was sometimes to speak of wants, of longing. And those things weren't safe. Better to pretend you didn't dream. Better to say, I slept well, thank you, even if you hadn't. Even if you woke with back pain, or a rat at your feet, even if you cried softly into a bundled apron because no one would know or care, but they did dream. Of course they did. Dreams of warmth, of quiet, of a bed with 4 walls around it, of not being called in the middle of the night, of not waking to frost on your eyelashes or a chamber pot overturned by a dog. And sometimes dreams of escape. We know this because of the rare letters that survive. One maid, writing to a cousin, spoke of dreaming she was married to a farmer, with his own bed. She wrote the word twice, own bed, as if to savor it. Another account tells of a boy who ran from his master's house after years of interrupted sleep and cruel discipline. He said he didn't care about hunger. He just wanted a sleep without a task waiting at the end. Not all servants lived in misery. Many found quiet dignity in their roles, even affection from their masters. But the lack of rest, true rest, was something universal. And for nobles, they too were denied something: the unwatched night. Their chambers were private, yes, but never entirely. Guards stood near. Ladies in waiting dozed outside. Doors were locked, but not always from the inside. Their sleep too was observed, maintained, interrupted, not by obligation, but by expectation. There's an odd equality in that. Neither the lowest nor highest ever slept entirely in peace, one because they were needed, the other because they were feared. And so medieval sleep was not soft. It was not gentle. It was not consistent. It was fragile, conditional, and filled with the echoes of wooden floors and whispered commands. And yet, people lived. They woke, worked, and slept again. They laughed at night, even on the cold floors. They sang lullabies even in overcrowded rooms. They found small comforts: a hot stone, a shared blanket, a story murmured in the dark. There was, in all this discomfort, a kind of resilience, a quiet triumph, because no one gave it to them. They carved it out themselves, between duties, between rushes, between one bell and the next. And now, as we lie in modern beds, memory foam, climate control, silk pillowcases, it's easy to forget what it meant to sleep when sleep wasn't. They're yours to keep. So tonight, if you wake and feel safe, if no one is standing over you with a request or a task or a command, if your mattress is yours and your warmth is quiet, you carry with you a history of those who slept so you could sleep better. And that leads us to the final reflection in this chapter. If our comfort today rests on the unnoticed labor of those before us, what does it mean to forget their sleep? Entirely. It's late, you're cold, tired, and afraid. You've traveled a long way, on foot, through woods, through roads that vanish in the dark. There are wolves in these parts, and worse, thieves, deserters, spirits. But up ahead through the fog you see it, a stone chapel, small, quiet. The windows glow faintly with candlelight. You walk faster, because tonight, like so many others before you, you'll sleep in the churchyard. It sounds strange to modern ears. Sleeping among graves. But in the Middle Ages it was far more common than we might think. Not only for pilgrims and wanderers, but for villagers, outcasts, even the sick. The dead, it was believed, protected the living. And the ground around a church wasn't just sacred, it was safe. Let's begin with the reason. Medieval Europe was a world of fear. Disease, robbery, war, starvation. You could be born healthy in spring and dead by autumn. A journey of 10 miles could turn fatal without warning. And in that brutal uncertainty, people sought protection from the only thing more permanent than kings or cities: the church. Church grounds, especially those encircling old chapels or parish halls, were considered hallowed. Evil, it was believed, couldn't cross them. Spirits were said to falter near consecrated ground, and so when the sun dipped low and safety vanished with the light, some people chose to sleep among the tombs. Not because they were ghoulish, but because it was the only place left where no one would hurt them. Imagine it. You're a widow with no family. You've been turned away from the inn, you have no coin, and the night is turning cold. You find a wall of crumbling stones and climb over it. Inside the yard, the grass is long and wet. The stones lean this way and that, some carved, with names, most unmarked. You find a spot beneath the eaves of the chapel, where the rain doesn't fall as hard, and you lie down, cloak tight around you, your head against a gravestone. This isn't unusual. In fact, some churchyards were known for offering refuge. In northern France and parts of the Holy Roman Empire, travelers knew which chapels allowed wayfarers to rest near their walls. In Spain, shrines along the Camino de Santiago often had benches or stone niches where pilgrims could curl up for the night. And in England, the tradition of church ales and festivals meant that many rural churches doubled as community spaces. During feast days or local fairs, people drank, sang, danced, and then simply fell asleep nearby, sometimes inside. You see, churches weren't always locked at night. In small villages they remained open. Their floors, cold and flagstoned, could become shelters. A beggar might sleep under a pew. A traveller might curl up beneath the rood screen. A mother with children might huddle near the altar, trusting that no one would harm her there. Clergy sometimes turned a blind eye. Sometimes they even allowed it, especially in winter, because they knew to sleep outside the church could mean death. But the practice wasn't always about survival. Sometimes it was devotional. There were those who slept in churchyards for spiritual reasons, to be closer to a saint's relics, to weep over a loved one's grave, to fulfill a vow of pilgrimage. Some slept among the tombs in hope of healing. If your child was sick, and you believed their illness was cursed, you might bring them to the churchyard and sleep by a holy well or stone, hoping the earth itself would draw out the evil. In a world where medicine failed and superstition thrived, the act of sleeping near the sacred was a form of prayer, a way to say, I have no one else, I trust only this. And the dead? The dead weren't feared as they are now. They were part of the community. Graveyards weren't sterile lawns. They were filled with familiar names, grandparents, neighbors, the baker who gave you burnt bread, the child who died last spring. People visited graves often, sometimes daily. To weep, yes, but also to talk, to remember, to rest, to lie down beside the dead wasn't horrifying, it was comforting. And yet, not everyone saw it that way. There were fears, too. Old superstitions whispered of the restless dead, of spirits who woke on certain nights, of witches who stole warmth from sleepers. In some regions, people placed stones over graves not to mark the name, but to hold the dead down. It was said that if you slept too close to a newly buried body, you might wake with their dreams, or worse, their hunger. And yet still people came, because there are fears in this world greater than ghosts. Cold, hunger, violence, loneliness, and the churchyard, for all its bones and shadows, didn't judge you. It didn't ask for coin. It didn't lock its doors. It didn't turn you away for being old or sick or strange. The living might call you mad, but the dead were silent. And in that silence, there was peace. So tonight, as you lie in your own bed, imagine that other. Bed, cold stone, wet grass, and the curve of a tomb behind your back. Imagine the candle in the chapel window still flickering, the wind shifting the long grass, the feel of being unseen, but somehow not alone. And ask yourself this: if the dead once gave rest to the weary, who offers that comfort now? The night deepens. The church bell has long since rung its final hour. The candles in the nave are snuffed. In the darkness of the yard, someone shifts beneath a cloak. Someone else coughs softly. In the hush between breaths you can hear it. The creak of branches, the groan of old stone, the sound of wind moving through lichen-covered crosses. It's not just a place of sleep, it's a place of memory. Churchyards in the Middle Ages weren't remote, sterile plots of land separated from life. They were at the center of it. Quite literally, most villages were built around the church, and the church around its dead. The idea that the living and the dead should be kept apart is a modern one. In medieval life, death was close, familiar. You lived with it, ate near it, walked over it. And yes, slept beside it. This wasn't seen as strange. It was seen as sacred. Let's start with the burials themselves. In many communities, graves were shallow. They were marked not by marble headstones but by wood or by memory. Many went unmarked. Some families placed simple carvings, a cross, a symbol, a name if they could write. But the earth was reused constantly. Graves were dug, filled, and eventually dug again. It was not uncommon to sleep above the bones of several generations, and no one found that odd, because the churchyard was alive with more than just memory. It was used, not just as a place of mourning, but as a place of gathering. On feast days, villagers brought food and sat among the stones. They laid blankets, lit small fires, and ate. They sang songs, some sacred, some not. Children played games, skipping around the graves, not out of disrespect, but out of innocence. The graveyard was simply part of the village, and if a stranger needed shelter, they knew where to go. Because while inns were expensive and barns were locked, churchyards were open. A traveller might approach at dusk and ask the priest's permission to sleep near the chapel wall. If he was polite and quiet and didn't cause trouble, he was allowed. Sometimes the priest even offered him bread or cheese, a drink of water, her blessing. In a world where hospitality could mean life or death, the church was often the only place where compassion still lived after sunset, and it wasn't only the desperate who slept there. Pilgrims, thousands of them, traveled long roads to reach holy shrines, to Santiago, to Canterbury, to Cologne. Most were poor, many were ill. They carried little more than a staff, a satchel, and a scrap of parchment proving their intent. For them, sleep was always uncertain. So they slept in churchyards, alone or in clusters, beneath hedgerows, under eaves, beside tombs, wrapped in blankets or cloaks, faces to the sky. In some towns, the local custom was to leave out straw bundles for pilgrims, just enough to soften the ground. And then there were the penitents, those seeking forgiveness from God, or perhaps just themselves. Some slept on graves by choice, believing the presence of the dead made them humble. A man who had wronged his brother might sleep 3 nights beside his father's grave. A woman accused of gossip might lie among the tombs of nuns, praying for quietness of soul. There are records of ritual sleep, where certain spots were believed to cure illness, lift curses, or offer visions. In parts of Ireland and Wales, the sick would lie on Saint Stones, broad flat slabs that once marked the resting place of a holy figure. They'd spend the night there, praying, shivering, dreaming. Sometimes they left healed, sometimes not, but always they left changed. And in that silence, amid the moss and the bone and the early morning dew, there was something else. Belonging. Because the graveyard was not a place of horror. It was a place of history. The dead were family, the saints were neighbors. The bones beneath your feet were yours, not in possession but in origin. One day you would lie here too, and maybe someone would sleep above you, years from now, seeking the same quiet you had once found. That idea of continuity was powerful. So powerful, in fact, that even nobles sometimes asked to be buried in graveyards with the common people rather than in sealed crypts. They wanted to lie near their parish, near their servants, near their childhood nursemaid, not because they were humble, but because they wanted to remain part of something, a community, a rhythm, a story. And in that story, sleep was part of death, and death was part of sleep. Of course, there were fears too. Not all tombs were quiet. Some whispered. Medieval folklore is rich with tales of those who slept too close to cursed graves, of children who vanished, of bones that moved, of laughter heard beneath the dirt. There were tales of sinful souls who could not rest, who twisted in their graves at night, disturbing the dreams of those nearby. Some villages left offerings, bread, milk, coins to appease them. But most did not fear the dead. They feared being forgotten, and so they welcomed the sleepers, the wanderers, the sorrowful, because in letting someone rest near your grave, you remained part of the world above, part of its breath, its movement, its need, and that perhaps was the real prayer. Let me be remembered, not with flowers, but with footsteps. And so we must ask, if the dead once gave comfort to the living, do we still honor them by letting them be part of our nights? The sun rises over the chapel. A thin golden light touches the crooked headstones. A bird sings from a stone cross. The wind has gone still. You stir beneath your wool cloak, bones aching slightly from the cold ground. You survived the night, and you were not alone. All around you other travelers rise. Some stretch, some pray. Some simply walk away in silence without looking back. The chapel doors open. Morning prayers begin. You brush the dirt from your sleeves and rejoin the living. But the memory of the night remains. You slept with the dead, and you were safer for it. This was the end of many medieval nights, and the beginning of another day, but not forever, because over time, the churchyard grew quiet. Not from reverence, but from regulation. By the 16th century, Europe was changing. The Reformation, the rise of towns, the spread of printed laws, and with that came a shift in the way sleep and death were understood. The sacred gave way to the sanitary. Church authorities began to discourage overnight stays in churchyards. It wasn't always out of disrespect. It was out of fear. Disease, they thought, spread through miasma, bad air, and graveyards filled with unsealed tombs and decomposing bodies were blamed. City councils passed ordinances banning sleeping in cemeteries. Churches locked their doors at night. Some churchyards were walled off. Others were moved outside town limits entirely. Death was pushed to the margins, geographically and culturally. The graveyard sleeper became a problem to be solved. A vagrant, a threat. And the people who had once whispered their sorrows among the tombs, they vanished, not literally, but socially. Their stories faded, their presence forgotten, and what had once been a nightly ritual became a distant superstition. The idea of sleeping in a graveyard grew strange, then scary, then taboo. By the 18th century, literature reflected the shift. Graveyards were settings for horror, not rest. Ghost stories, Gothic novels. Tombs became symbols of fear, not familiarity. The dead were now other, untouchable, to be mourned from afar, not lived beside. And in this transition, something else was lost. The idea of rest as refuge. We built homes, beds, softness, safety, but we lost the practice of turning to the sacred when we had nowhere else to go. Because that's what those graveyard nights were. Not just desperate, but devout. To sleep in a churchyard was to say, the world has no space for me, but God might. And even now there are remnants. In remote villages, elderly caretakers still speak of the time a stranger slept beneath the bell tower. In oral histories, pilgrims still talk about the peace found lying near the bones of saints. In some places, small shrines still offer benches, unofficial, unused, meant for rest. Not prayer, not performance, just rest. We like to think of modern sleep as superior. A mattress, a room, a lock. But is it? Is it truly better to sleep behind a door, disconnected from all things sacred and rooted, than to lie beneath the stars, trusting your body to memory and mercy? And maybe that's why graveyards still whisper, not to scare us, but to remind us that once, not so long ago, the line between rest and reverence was thin, that sleep wasn't just an escape, it was a ritual, that the dead didn't frighten the weary. They sheltered them, and if we close our eyes gently tonight, we might hear them still, not voices, not ghosts, but a quiet welcome, the hush of long grass, the warmth of old stone, the breath of a world that once made room for those who had no place to go. And so we end this story where we began, beneath the eaves, among the bones, beside the chapel, door with one final question. If you had no roof tonight, no shelter, no light, no promise, where would you lay your head? You wake in the dark, not because of noise, not because of light, but because your bladder is full, your legs ache, and the chill of night presses against your stomach like a stone. You need to relieve yourself, but there is no bathroom, no plumbing, no toilet. So you fumble in the dark, reach under the bed and pull out a cold round ceramic pot, rough around the edges, a little damp. This is your chamber pot, and it's full. Welcome to medieval night. We've talked about sleeping on straw, about curling next to fires, about sleeping with others, both living and dead. But now we turn to a subject avoided in noble texts and forgotten in history books. What did people do when they had to pee at night? The answer is simple, and also complicated, and also disgusting. Let's begin with the basic truth. There was no plumbing, none, no pipes, no flushes, no taps. In castles, monasteries, huts, or towns, when nature called, the answer was human ingenuity, and a heavy reliance on vessels, corners, courtyards, and prayer. And so the chamber pot became a quiet necessity. For those unfamiliar, a chamber pot is a small, bowl-like container, usually made of ceramic or metal, designed to collect human waste during the night. It was stored under beds, beside chairs, in alcoves, or behind curtains. You didn't leave the house at night, not if you could help it. The streets were dangerous. There were no lights. The ground was uneven. There were thieves. There were wolves. And worse than all that, there were open sewers. Yes, because the street often was the sewer, and so the chamber pot, humble and silent, became your only hope. But here's the thing. It wasn't just a pee bucket. It was a daily object, deeply woven into medieval routines. In households, servants were tasked with emptying them each morning, often into cesspits, ditches, or simply out the back door. In cities where proximity made things worse, some homes had wooden chutes, garderobes, that led directly to the outside wall. The waste landed in a trench, a gutter, or the street itself. Some people didn't even bother with a pot. They used communal corners. That's right. In peasant cottages, it wasn't uncommon to designate a place in the room, a corner near the door or hearth, where people relieved themselves discreetly, especially children. Covered with straw, masked with herbs, cleaned rarely. You might be wondering, what did it smell like? That question haunted everyone. Even in the grandest castles, the air was not fresh. Tapestries and rushes tried to mask it, but the mix of sweat, ash, livestock, cooking, and bodily waste lingered always. In fact, odors shaped architecture. Some noble homes had entire privy towers, vertical shafts that allowed waste to fall directly into pits below. These were early toilets in a sense, but they were cold, dangerous, and loud. You could literally hear someone relieving themselves several floors up or down. And still, most people didn't use them at night. Why? Because of the cold, because of ghosts, because of laziness, because of fear. There are accounts of people too afraid to use the guardrobe at night for fear of being pushed from it. Others feared demonic spirits that hid in dark privies. The Latin word for toilet, latrina, shares roots with filth and corruption. Toilets were not safe zones. They were liminal, dangerous, spirit-filled. So people turned to the chamber pot, and therein lies the real medieval nightmare. Because if you shared a bed, or a room, or a hall, you shared the pot. Multiple people, one vessel, no lid. It sat under the bed, under the bench, under the baby. It spilled, it sloshed, it was forgotten. And sometimes, let's be honest, it was missed. There are humorous mentions in medieval letters and poems of unfortunate accidents. Servants stepping in, pots, children knocking them over, guests mistaking them for stools. In fact, one 14th century French tale describes a young man trying to sneak across a chamber at night to visit his lover, only to slip barefoot in someone else's leavings. He did not win her heart. And yet, chamber pots were personal items. They could be ornate. Noble women had them decorated with initials. Wealthy men had theirs made of brass. One surviving pot from 15th century London is inscribed, "Use me well, and I shall serve thee sweetly." But they weren't cleaned daily. Not properly, not in the way we'd expect. Soap was expensive, water had to be fetched, and so the pot became a symbol of tolerance, of endurance, of how much discomfort you were willing to live with to survive the night. And then there was the morning, when pots had to be emptied, and that was another kind of chaos because the waste had to go somewhere. In villages, you tossed it in ditches or onto midden heaps. In towns, you carried it to the edge of the property, or out the window, yes, out the window into the street. Medieval cities had laws about it. Some towns only allowed dumping at certain hours. In Paris, you had to shout "Gardez-l'eau" before pouring, a corruption of the French "Gardez-l'eau," watch out for the water. But not everyone obeyed, and pedestrians learned to walk. Close to the walls, not the center of the road, where the danger fell from above. So tonight as you lie in bed, in your clean room, with indoor plumbing, and privacy, and a door that locks, remember this. The medieval sleeper didn't just endure cold or noise or rats. They endured each other, and their waste. And they did it quietly, because there was no alternative. And so we end with a simple question. Could you still fall asleep, knowing what waited under your bed? Picture yourself in a medieval city. Let's say London or Paris, maybe Bruges. It's just before dawn. The streets are still asleep, if you can call it that. There are no carts yet, no church bells, only the occasional shuffle of a baker rising too early, or a night watchman grumbling to himself. You lean out of your wooden window. Below you is not pavement, not cobblestone, just dirt and mud and everything else. You reach for your pot. It's full, heavy, warm still. You don't think twice. You dump it right out the window, and just like that, you're part of the city's daily rhythm. Because for all the ceremony and ritual of medieval life, The disposal of human waste was entirely unceremonious. It happened daily. It happened constantly. And it happened everywhere. In cities, houses pressed close together. Streets were narrow, dark, and damp. There were no underground sewers, not really. At best, there were trenches along the street's edge called kennels or gutters. These channeled waste toward rivers or cesspools, but most of the time they just overflowed, especially after rain. The smells? Unimaginable. In fact, visitors from less urban regions often wrote of being physically ill upon arriving in cities. One German traveller to 14th century London described it as a place where the air grew thick from filth and the ground was soft with sorrow. He was not speaking metaphorically, and chamber pots were part of it because not everyone had a privy, and even those who did rarely used it at night. Privies, especially in cities, were often communal, shared between multiple households, located outside near the back of a yard or connected to a cesspit. To use it meant stepping into the dark, cold, rat-infested alley at 3 a.m. So instead, you went in the pot, and the pot went in the street. And the street, it didn't go anywhere. In summer, the heat turned waste into steam. It rose between buildings, it clung to tapestries, it followed people home. Women soaked herbs in vinegar and dabbed them under their noses to block the stench. Men rubbed there, beards with scented oils. Even cats looked offended. In winter, the pots didn't smell quite as strong, but the contents froze, and nothing says good morning like chipping your own frozen urine out of a ceramic bowl before breakfast. Some towns attempted reform. London passed laws as early as the 1300s to regulate the dumping of chamber pots. Offenders could be fined or publicly shamed, but enforcement was rare. Who would patrol the streets for pee at sunrise? And besides, everyone did it. Nobles in their upper chambers, barmaids above taverns, doctors, priests, midwives, even the sheriff. Because no one wanted to go outside, no one wanted to find the privy in the dark, and no one wanted to wake fully just to relieve themselves. So the pot remained, a constant companion, hidden under beds, tucked behind curtains, brought out without ceremony. Children were trained to use them early. Infants went in basins. Elders used walking sticks to reach theirs. Pregnant women kept them close. Drunks often missed. There are town records noting the punishment for spilling one's night waste upon a neighbor's stoop. And still, the pot endured. It even traveled. Pilgrims carried small portable chamber pots, clay or wooden bowls that could be emptied behind hedges or in ditches. Wealthy travelers had ornate versions lined with pewter or wrapped in cloth. Some knights brought them on campaign. Monks had them built into alcoves near their sleeping cells. And yet, for all this familiarity, the chamber pot was never truly mentioned. Not in the polite records, not in noble diaries, rarely in sermons. It was a quiet tool, an invisible object. Everyone used it, no one acknowledged it, and that's the heart of medieval sleep. You suffered in silence. You shared your space. You shared your smells. You shared your shame, and through it all, you tried to rest. It's easy to romanticize the Middle Ages. Stone walls, flickering candles, long beds with velvet curtains. But behind every elegant chamber was a pot. Behind every bed was a reality. Basic, bodily, human. And that perhaps is what makes it all feel real. Because no matter your rank, duke or beggar, priest or peasant, when night came and your stomach turned and the cold pressed into your spine, you reached for the same solution, a humble bowl, an object too mundane to name, and the next morning someone, maybe you, carried it to the window and threw your night into the world. So tonight, in your own room, clean, and sealed and bright. Spare, a thought for those who slept with waste under their beds. And ask yourself, if we hide what keeps us human, do we lose part of what made us endure? Morning in a medieval household began not with songbirds or soft light, but with the scraping of pots, before the fire was relit, before bread was broken, before even the animals were fed. Someone had to take the waste away. It might be a child, a servant, a spouse. Whoever was lowest in the household order often took up the thankless task. They'd lift the pot carefully, sometimes more than one, walk it through the corridor or hall, and out into the open air. The smell followed them, a sour mist of fermented sleep. This act, mundane as it was, marked the start of the day. The invisible labor of human waste defined not only medieval hygiene, but medieval life itself. And it persisted quietly for centuries. By the late Middle Ages, there were attempts to improve things. Cesspits were deepened. Public latrines were built near markets or docks. Privy chambers became more common in noble homes. Some even used night soil men, workers hired to collect waste from urban households and dump it far from the city. But none of this made night easier. Not for the sleeper who woke with urgency. Not for the servant who cleaned the pot and said nothing. And not for the city dweller who knew better than to step out without looking up. So how did this end? Slowly, very slowly. Indoor plumbing, as we know it today, began to appear in the 18th and 19th centuries with early experiments in water closets and flush systems. But these were expensive, fragile, and unreliable. The poor still used pots. Even the middle classes, until the early 20th century, kept a chamber pot in the bedroom, just in case. It wasn't until the spread of modern sewer systems and pressurized water and the cultural shift toward privacy and hygiene that the chamber pot began to disappear. And even then it lingered in rural homes, in hospitals, in nurseries, in wartime trenches. Even today the idea survives, just renamed, just hidden. We don't call it a chamber pot anymore, but we still keep bedside toilets for emergencies. We still whisper about nighttime needs in hospitals and care homes. The need hasn't vanished, just the language. And so, what does all this say? About sleep? It says that rest was never clean, that comfort was something carved out from inconvenience, that even in silence the body had its way. It says that sleep, true sleep, was something you earned after discomfort, not by escaping it, but by surviving it. And the chamber pot, unspeakable as it was, tells us more about the real Middle Ages than any throne or tapestry. It tells us about humility, about adaptation, about the things people didn't write down because they didn't have to, everyone already knew. It tells us that people didn't sleep in peace because their rooms were tidy. They slept in peace because they were tired, because their days were long, their beds were full, their bones were sore, and they had learned to accept imperfection, to sleep beside smell, to dream above waste, to wake not in shame, but simply in continuation. And maybe that's the most human thing of all tonight, if you wake up needing to go, and you walk across a clean floor and flush away your discomfort with a touch of your hand. Remember those who came before you, who couldn't walk, who couldn't flush, who couldn't forget the object beneath the bed, but slept anyway. And so we close this strange and necessary story with one last thought. The quiet dignity of rest is not found in perfection, but in knowing what must be endured to make it through the night. You lie in bed, it's late, the fire is out, the pot is emptied. You finally found a patch of warmth in the straw. You close your eyes, and then it starts. The crawling. Something on your neck, your ankle. The sharp, familiar pinch of a flea biting just below your knee. You slap at it, rub your foot, shift your weight. But it doesn't matter, because in a medieval bed, you are never alone. Not really. There is no such thing as an insect-free night. Let's be clear. Bedbugs and fleas weren't an occasional nuisance in the Middle Ages. They were a constant presence. So constant that most people didn't even bother to complain. Because who would you complain to? Everyone had them, even kings, even nuns, even the cleanest, richest, holiest person you could imagine. The concept of personal space didn't exist the way it does now. Neither did the idea of sleeping in a sealed, sterilized, bug-resistant environment. Your bed was alive, and not always in the poetic sense. Let's start with fleas. Fleas thrived in medieval life. On people, on pets, on straw bedding, on clothing, on children, on monks, on wood beams, in rugs, rushes, shoes, and cloaks, and yes, especially in beds. They didn't just bite, they laid eggs. Hundreds, thousands. They nested in the seams of mattresses, in the corners of bed frames, in the folds of your tunic. You might wake up scratching so violently that your skin bled, and the only relief more scratching. Fleas brought more than discomfort. They brought plague, the Black Death, among others. But even in times when plague wasn't raging, they made sleep shallow, itchy, and miserable. Then there were bedbugs. Smaller, harder to see, but no less persistent. These creatures, drawn by body heat and breath, came out after dark to feed. They bit in rows, often on shoulders, arms, and legs, leaving itchy welts that burned in the morning light. They could live for months in wood joints or under mattresses without feeding. They hid by day, they crawled by night, and once they infested a bed, they stayed. No fumigation, no pesticides, just resignation. Then there were lice, not just on heads, but in bed sheets, under clothing, in beards and eyebrows. Entire monastic orders had rules about shaving heads and scrubbing linens, but lice still found their way back. Many people believed lice were a natural part of the human body, that they grew from sweat, that they appeared in times of spiritual impurity. Some saints were said to have tolerated lice as a sign of humility. Others claimed that scratching was a way of meditating on suffering. Then came the mice, the fleas on the mice, the cats who chased the mice but couldn't stop the infestation, and let's not forget flies. In summer months, they bred in chamber, pots, bread crusts, and the open wounds of the sick. They buzzed around beds, laid eggs in damp straw, and left behind crawling larvae. So imagine this. You're lying on a straw-stuffed sack that hasn't been changed in months. You're sleeping beside someone who hasn't bathed since the last market fair. The room is warm from breath and fire. It is the perfect environment for everything that creeps, hops, and bites. And yet, people slept. Because they had to. Because no one expected perfect rest. Because the world was full of hardship, and a few bugs didn't stop the day from starting again. They coped. They brushed the straw clean when they could. They hung blankets in the sun to smoke out the fleas. They used herbs, lavender, mint, rosemary, wormwood, to discourage insects. They burned rushes. They slept in shifts, rotating which side of the bed got the worst of it. There are letters from nobles who joke about bedbugs. One countess wrote to her sister, "Tell mother the bugs are bigger than mice here and twice as bold." Some even named them. Children gave fleas little curses. Wives blamed bedbugs on their husbands' sweat. Superstitions sprang up. Scratch your left leg 3 times and say a prayer, and the lice would leave. Hang a sprig of rue above your bed and the bugs would die. Place a stone under your pillow to draw out the itch. None of it worked, but it gave people something to believe in. And yet, it wasn't just the insects. It was the proximity. You didn't sleep alone. You shared your bed with your spouse, with your children, with guests, with servants, with animals, with lice, with everything. And no one asked if you were comfortable, because the question didn't exist. Comfort wasn't the goal. Survival was. You slept because you had to wake. You endured because there was no alternative. So tonight, in your own bed, soft, sealed, sanitized, imagine what it meant to lie in. A scratchy tunic beside a snoring cousin, scratching at the night's visitors, knowing they would return tomorrow, and ask yourself how deeply would you sleep if you knew the bed itself was awake. Imagine waking to a whisper, not from a voice but from movement, a rustle in the straw, the pinch of a bite, the sensation of something crawling across your neck that disappears before you can find it. You're not dreaming, you never were. In the medieval world, a bed wasn't just a place to rest. It was a habitat. Let's revisit that bed, not the noble's bed draped in velvet, but the bed of most people, a sack stuffed with straw or reeds. Sometimes wool, if you were lucky. The stuffing wasn't changed weekly or even monthly. It was used until it broke down, flattened by weight, dampened by sweat, softened by wear, darkened by time. You might fluff it once in a while. You might beat it with a stick. But deep inside, where the warmth of sleep never quite dried, the bugs waited. Bed bugs, fleas, lice, and those were just the start. Some people layered old clothes under their blankets to soften the bed, but those clothes carried their own infestations. A child's tunic worn during chores might harbor mites. A blanket handed down from a grandmother might hum with years of company, and so you didn't sleep on the bed. You slept in it, in the nest of history, sweat, ash, and skin. Because yes, skin. Dead skin cells were everywhere. The mattress breathed. Them in nightly. And where skin settled, so did mites. Not the kind you see, but the kind that live in silence, feeding, breeding, crawling. So when we talk about medieval beds, we're not talking about objects. We're talking about ecosystems, and they weren't quiet. The sound of scratching, yours or your neighbor's, was part of the night. So was the sound of slapping, of groaning, of whispered curses in the dark. And in a house of 10 or more people, sleeping, close, sleeping hot, there was no privacy to suffer in silence. One person's itch became everyone's. And yet, no one really blamed anyone, because it was understood, expected. You might roll your eyes at the fleas, but you wouldn't judge your neighbor for having them. Who didn't? Even nobility faced the same reality. Kings ordered their beds aired, tapestries beaten, blankets perfumed. But no amount of clove or cinnamon or rose oil could stop what lived beneath the stitching. In one surviving account from a royal servant's journal, he describes changing the king's sheets and removing the insects as a gentleman might remove crumbs from a coat. No shame, just duty. And in monasteries, monks battled bugs not with weapons but with routine. Mattresses were turned, blankets shaken, hair tonsured to reduce lice. Linen shifts were boiled when water was available. Some orders required complete silence during these tasks, as if humility extended to the lice itself. But nothing ever worked forever, because these weren't modern times. There was no bleach, there were no sprays, just herbs, vinegar, smoke. In southern Europe, people would smoke out their beds, literally lighting bundles of rosemary or dried sage and waving the smoke beneath the sheets to drive out the fleas. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. And all of this brings us back to how people coped. Because they did cope. They slept anyway. They scratched, they grumbled. They woke with bites on their arms, welts on their necks, and still managed to rise for work. Parents picked lice from their children's hair by candlelight. Lovers whispered, over the sound of scratching. Pilgrims washed their feet, blessed their temples, and lay down in flea-ridden inns without complaint. And when someone did complain, they were told to thank God it wasn't worse, that the bugs were a reminder of the body, that even saints scratched, even saints bled. Some medieval writings suggested that suffering through bug bites was a form of spiritual purification, a way to humble the flesh, to remember that comfort is not promised even in sleep, and in this discomfort there was community. People shared treatments, shared remedies, shared stories of the worst nights, the flea that jumped from one person to another, the lice that survived 3 washings, the time someone accidentally burned their straw mattress while trying to smoke out the mites. They laughed about it, because if they didn't laugh, they'd cry. And crying in a room full of scratching people just made the bugs move faster. So they carried on. They survived. Not because it was easy, not because they were comfortable, but because they knew sleep was necessary, even if it came crawling. So next time you tuck yourself into clean sheets and spray your lavender mist and stretch out in the comfort of solitude, spare a thought for those who scratched through the centuries, who didn't expect peace, who welcomed sleep like a thief, quickly, briefly, before the bugs could wake again, and ask yourself, what kind of strength does it take to rest in a bed that never truly rests? By morning your skin is dotted, not from a rash, not from some passing illness, but from a night of visitors. 3 bites in a row, that's the bedbug's calling card. A line across the arm, or thigh, or shoulder. Your fingernails are dirty from scratching. You stretch, yawn, and brush bits of straw from your skin. Someone nearby is still asleep, scratching in their sleep. You smile faintly. This is life. Itch, scratch, sleep, repeat. But it isn't just physical discomfort that defines this experience. It's what comes after. It's the memory of the night. The fact that you will carry it into your morning, into your work, into your interactions. You will speak to people with skin still burning. You'll walk to the well with your calf twitching from a bite you haven't reached yet. You'll sow or thresh or knead dough with that lingering tickle in the back of your mind. The bugs don't just feed, they follow. And for the medieval sleeper, that was a truth so common, it went unspoken. Let's talk for a moment about shame, because as infestations became more closely associated with poverty and uncleanliness in later centuries, people began to hide them. But in the Middle Ages, they were normal. No one expected you to be clean by modern standards. Cleanliness was measured differently. You were clean if your clothes weren't visibly soiled. You were clean if you didn't smell too strong. You were clean if you weren't visibly sick. You could have lice, fleas, bugs, bites, and still be considered fine, still be holy, still be noble. Even royalty had bedchambers fumigated. Letters between queens and their maids mention pestilence among the linens. Whole chambers were emptied and sun-dried. Mattresses were lifted into courtyards. Servants beat them with sticks, while others sprinkled dried herbs and vinegar. This was routine, not an emergency, just life. In inns, the quality of sleep was often judged by the number of bites received. A traveller might say, "The beer was good, the bread was stale, and I counted 39 fleas before sleep." That was not sarcasm, that was reportage. There were even folk remedies meant to charm the bugs away. Say a prayer to St. Macarius before bed. Leave a bowl of salt on the windowsill. Draw a chalk circle around your sleeping space. Did they work? No, but they gave people something to do, and that matters. Because when your sleep is under siege, not by dreams but by reality, you begin to ritualize your defense. You beat the straw 3 times. You flip your blanket once to shake the bugs. Loose, you scratch before lying down, hoping to dislodge what's hiding under your tunic. This is how you make peace with infestation. Through rhythm, through expectation, through surrender. Because you're not trying to conquer the bugs. You're just trying to get enough sleep to make it to tomorrow. And maybe that's the deepest truth about medieval rest. It wasn't about the perfect bed, or the absence of noise, or the smell of lavender. It was about tolerance, a thick-skinned, steady-hearted, quietly resilient kind of tolerance. One that said, yes, I itch. Yes, I'm cold. Yes, this mattress is alive. But I'll sleep anyway. And they did, night after night. With children beside them, with dogs at their feet, with lice in their hair, with fleas on their skin, with dreams that floated above all of it, light and distant, like smoke. And in the morning, they rose, not refreshed, not glowing, but ready. Because sleep, like life, was never perfect, only persistent. And the bugs, they stayed. They always stayed, which is why, centuries later, we still flinch at the idea, still joke about them, still fear the mattress that bites back. Because in those tiny creatures is a memory of what it meant to be human when humanity was vulnerable. So tonight, when you lie in bed, soft, sealed, untouched, take a breath, feel the stillness, and listen. There's no scratching, no crawling, no line of bites on your shoulder. You are alone in your bed, and that, perhaps, is a miracle we've forgotten to be grateful for. So we end with this. When sleep was shared with insects, with strangers, with cold and noise and smell, people still found rest. What's stopping us now? You're tired. It's late. Fire has burned low and the room smells of soot, sweat and stale ale. You've just arrived at the inn after walking 16 miles through rain and muck. You pay the innkeeper what little coin you have left, and he nods, not toward a room, but toward a bench, a cot, a shape in the shadows. Someone is already there. You'll be sleeping next to them. You don't know their name. You don't know where they're from. You don't know if they snore, if they smell, if they'll steal your shoes in the night. But that's not the question. The only question is, how quickly can you fall asleep beside them? Because shared sleep wasn't unusual in the Middle Ages. It was the norm. If you're imagining a world where everyone had their own room, think again. If you're imagining a world where strangers respected space and snuggled only by invitation, again. Think again. In the medieval world, a bed wasn't a private sanctuary, it was a shared resource, and it wasn't just at the inn. Across villages, towns, castles, and cloisters, beds were communal by design. Why? Let's start with simple facts. Beds were expensive. Good mattresses, frames, sheets, these took time and money. A feather bed might cost as much as a horse. Linen sheets were precious. A sturdy bed frame, a luxury passed down like a family heirloom. So, people shared. Younger siblings slept together. Apprentices shared cots. Servants nested like spoons in alcoves. A guest arriving late might be placed into an already occupied bed without ceremony. And the term bedfellow? It didn't mean what we think it does. It meant someone, often a same-sex friend, relative, or colleague, with whom you shared. A bed and nothing more. In fact, many friendships in the Middle Ages were quite literally built on shared sleep. Kings had bedfellows. Monks had bedfellows. Soldiers, students, pilgrims, laborers. Even powerful noblemen sometimes wrote fondly about long nights spent talking, praying, or simply lying beside their companions. In one recorded account from 13th century France, two knights, neither lovers nor brothers, slept side by side for nearly a year while serving a distant lord. They recorded their dreams, they shared wine, they made pacts in the dark. Their letters refer to the bed they shared as a tent of silence and trust. There were no boundaries, only bodies, and yes, sometimes that closeness led to trouble. Inns were notorious for their intimacy. You might arrive with 2 silver pennies and be placed in a 3-person bed between a coughing cloth merchant and a sailor with lice. You might be offered half a blanket, no pillow, and a very stern warning not to kick the other man too much. There were no partitions, no curtains, sometimes not even separate genders. You might find yourself next to a child, or a grandmother, or a stranger who didn't speak your language, and you slept anyway, you had to. There are records of people waking to find someone else had crawled in beside them during the night. Not to steal, but because it was cold, and because people moved. Through shared spaces like water, they filled what was warmest, softest, safest, and if you got up to relieve yourself, you came back to find someone had rolled into your spot. Too bad. Back to the floor. And yet somehow, this lack of space created an odd kind of intimacy. You learned people by their breathing, by the way they shifted in their sleep, by the weight of their elbow when they rolled into your ribs. You accepted it, not because you loved it, but because it meant you weren't alone. In a world where wolves howled outside the door and disease crept through streets, and sorrow came without warning, closeness was safety. Even if it meant waking to someone else's breath on our shared breathing warmth that held you until dawn. So tonight, when you stretch out in your own bed, clean sheets, quiet walls, the whole space yours, ask yourself, what would it be like to sleep where there were no edges between lives? You. Turn onto your side. Someone breathes against your back. Someone else shifts, sighs, mumbles in their sleep. The straw beneath you rustles. The blanket is pulled tight. Your knees touch someone else's. There's a foot near your face. And yet, you sleep. Because that's how it worked. You didn't ask for personal space. You didn't expect silence. You shared the bed, and you accepted what came with it. Let's move now from the inns to the household. In peasant homes, the bed was often the only soft place to sleep. Sometimes it was just a large sack of straw or a low wooden platform with ropes, shared by the entire family. Parents, children, grandparents, a baby, a dog, all together. And when guests came, you made room. You didn't clean the sheets. You didn't ask questions. You simply moved over and let them crawl in. Because hospitality didn't mean comfort. It meant inclusion. In fact, in some places, a warm spot in bed was the only thing you could offer. No food, no coin, no shelter from the rain, but warmth and the safety of breath. And that meant something. Even in noble homes, shared sleeping arrangements were common. Lords might have large canopied beds, but they rarely slept alone. Servants rested nearby, pages curled up at the foot. Wet nurses and children rotated through the chamber. Privacy was not expected. At court, bedfellows were often appointed based on rank or favor. To sleep beside a king didn't mean intimacy. It meant trust, that you could be near him in vulnerability, that you wouldn't steal, that you wouldn't talk, or if you did talk, that you wouldn't tell. Some monarchs recorded important conversations held in bed, soft whispers about marriage alliances, betrayals, confessions, pleas, promises. The bed became a political stage, a space where the line between public and private blurred completely. And in monasteries, communal dormitories held rows of narrow beds, sometimes with nothing more than a curtain between brothers. Silence was required, but still the sounds of sleep filled the space. Snoring, shifting, prayers muttered in dreams. Even in silence, the bodies were never truly alone. There was always another presence, a reminder that one was part of something greater, a rule, a rhythm, a vow, a shared air. And then there were the stranger beds, pilgrims on the road, widows in poorhouses, orphans in crowded parish lofts, prisoners, apprentices, paupers. All of them shared beds with whoever was there. There are records from charity houses describing 4-to-a-bed arrangements. Some separated by boards, most not. One parish document refers to bedding as stacked flesh, an image that says everything. But still, they slept. Because when you work from dawn to dark, when your limbs are sore and your breath shallow, when your belly is half full and your spine bent, sleep comes even in closeness, even in discomfort, maybe especially then. And there were moments of quiet tenderness too, parents wrapping children in their arms, siblings sleeping cheek to cheek, servants whispering jokes before fading into silence, friends pressing palms together, beneath the covers just to feel warmth. Not everything was hardship. There was closeness too, connection, something modern solitude can't always offer. Today, we avoid shared sleep. We build walls. We call separate beds a luxury. We apologize for snoring. But once, sleep wasn't about perfection. It was about presence, knowing that someone else was near. That if the wind howled, you wouldn't hear it alone. That if the fever returned, someone would feel your heat. That if you stopped breathing, someone would know. Because you weren't alone. You were held by the room. And even in a bed of strangers, there was something sacred about the shared breath, the shared rise and fall of chests, the collective stillness that came just before dreams. So tonight, when you stretch your limbs across an empty mattress and bask in silence, remember the countless generations who never had that luxury, and ask yourself, what does it mean to rest in peace? When that peace is made of bodies beside you, not silence around you. It's morning now. You wake not with an alarm, but with the stirrings of others. A cough, a groan. Someone stretches, bumping into your knee. Someone else rises quietly, stepping over sleeping limbs. The blanket shifts. Cold air creeps in. You open your eyes, and the first thing you see is someone else's face. This is not strange. This is not rude. This is normal. You slept with others. You woke with them. And now the day begins. Let's stay here a little longer. Because this moment, this waking together, tells us more about medieval life than any cathedral or crown. Because a shared bed was not just about sleep. It was about belonging, about function, about the reality that people once moved through the world in clusters, not corridors. Think of how we define wealth today. Privacy, space, silence, a separate room for each child, a guest room, a master suite. Luxury, we say, is distance. But in the Middle Ages, wealth didn't always buy distance. It just bought layers. More mattresses, more servants, more bodies between you and the cold. Even the king did not sleep alone. Not truly, not for long. There were guards outside, stewards nearby, his wife, his children, his pages, his fears. Always, someone somewhere breathing in the dark beside him. And maybe that wasn't a flaw. Maybe it was a kind of closeness we've forgotten how to feel, because to sleep beside someone, really sleep, is to trust them. With your breath, with your silence, with the shape your face makes when it relaxes, with the way your body folds when it gives in. And that trust, once given freely, has become rare. Today we build whole lives around the idea that our sleep should be untouched, that rest must be silent, that the room must be sealed, that anything less is failure. But for thousands of years, people didn't think that way. Sleep wasn't a fortress. It was a campfire, a shared warmth in the middle of the night, a reason not to fear the dark, a reminder that you were never truly alone, even when the bed was too small, even when the person next to you snored, even when someone rolled onto your arm and drooled in their sleep. You endured it, and you rested, because you belonged, and maybe that belonging was the point. When beds became private, we gained comfort, but we lost that. And maybe that's why we feel so alone in the dark now. Why we check our phones before bed, why we leave the television on, why silence sometimes feels heavier than noise, because somewhere inside us is the memory of sleep shared, of rooms full of breathing, of straw beds that creaked beneath laughter, of the simple relief of hearing someone else sigh in the dark and knowing you are still here. That you woke up, that they woke up, that the world continues. So here at the end of this story, let's remember, shared beds weren't just survival. They were connection. They taught patience. They taught tolerance. They taught us to rest even when rest wasn't perfect, and maybe, just maybe, they gave us a kind of warmth we don't know how to ask for anymore. Take off your shirt, your shoes, your belt, your robe. It's night in the Middle Ages, and the fire has gone out. You lie down in straw, on wool, beside your family, or a stranger, or alone with your thoughts. And now comes the question, do you sleep in your clothes, or do you bare your skin to the night? The answer isn't simple. It depends on your station, your beliefs, your body, and whether you fear the cold more than you fear the judgment of others. Because sleeping in the nude, or near nude, was not taboo in the medieval world. Not in the way we often assume. In fact, it was common, practical, expected in some places, frowned upon in others, but it was always noticed. Let's begin with the practicality. Most people slept fully or partially clothed, but not because they were modest, they were cold. Medieval homes had no insulation, no windows in the modern sense, no central heating. You wore what you needed to survive the night. That might be your day tunic, a wool shift, a mantle, socks, a cap. Some even slept in gloves. But what if you weren't cold? What if it was summer? What if you lived in the south? What if your clothes were wet? Then yes, you might sleep naked, and no one would look twice. There are accounts, especially from warmer regions like Spain and southern France, of people sleeping bare-skinned during summer months. Entire families laying out on rooftops or porches, shedding everything in the name of airflow and sleep. Even monks in some orders were allowed to remove their habits at night and sleep in simple linen shifts, or nothing at all, depending. On climate and rule, In fact, nudity itself wasn't necessarily shameful. It was contextual. If you were bathing, giving birth, washing clothes, or sleeping, you might be seen nude, and that was tolerated, expected. Life was physical. The body wasn't private the way we now imagine, but there were limits, especially when rank was involved. A noblewoman might sleep in a linen smock, clean, stitched, perfumed, not because she feared exposure, but because her status demanded presentation, even in sleep. Her body was watched more closely, her modesty more performative. Likewise, young men of wealth were often expected to sleep in nightshirts or robes, not just to preserve heat, but to signify discipline. But among the lower classes, the line between clothed and unclothed was thinner. Your shirt was your bedding, your body was your blanket, and if you had no one to impress, and no one to answer to, and no coins for extra cloth, you let the skin breathe. That said, nakedness was still gendered. Men sleeping in the nude was more tolerated, women more complicated.